Okay, so we are hopefully going to do a group shake, but we can also delve into our parts work a little bit more. Most of you have had some introduction to the concept of parts work, but I have another flowchart that I just made sure was up on your alumni course curriculum. It's called Parts Work Flowchart and Art Prompt. And so this is something that you may want to work on your own time and see what comes up. And it's something that we could work on in our one-on-one monthly session if you want to go deeper into it, or book extra sessions for that as well. So let me share this chart so you can see it. Alrighty. So as just a refresher, the concept of parts work always starts with the concept of the core self, right? And this is self. I put everything in caps here, so it's hard to tell, but it's self with a capital S. It's the self that maybe some people would call the soul or our source energy. It's actually what in Buddhism they would call no self, which I think is kind of funny. This is the self that uncovers when your mind gets quiet, and that's why they call it in Buddhism no self. But in this concept, it's called self, and it's the same thing. It's what happens when the rest of the parts of you quiet down, what comes up. And the person who developed parts work, Dr. Richard Schwartz, he has been working with all kinds of people, from every walk of life you can imagine, every life experience you can imagine, even people who have come from very extreme trauma, or people who have done, objectively heinous things. I mean, people who have, done violent cruelty to others. He's worked in prisons and things like that. And after 30 years of doing this work, his conclusion is that everybody, no exception, has a self. Has a core self, that when you can really get through the noise and you can really get through all these other parts, there is a self there. And this self has some innate qualities. It has, he uses the 8 C's. You might recognize it also from the visualization that we sometimes do of the safe place and bringing your guides in. So this is going to be your inner wisdom, your inner strength, and your inner compassion. These are correlated with the qualities of the 8C in parts work, which is things like clarity, courage, compassion, but also things like connectedness, right? So there's 8 of these different qualities that the core self contains. And his argument is that, look, I've worked with all kinds of people coming from all kinds of situations. We all have these traits innately. They are not taught. Right. And this is actually a little bit of a contradiction to attachment theory, which you've talked about too, which is the idea that we need to be modeled these traits in our relationships early on to gain them. And Dr. Richard Schwartz would argue, no, we don't need them modeled. We actually just innately contain these qualities. Now, I actually think both theories can be true. I think they both give some value, because we are going to develop more parts if we have, disrupted attachment style early in our life. So I think they can actually both go together. But just kind of an interesting contrast there. So the self, and most of us have had glimmers of this, right? When we do this visualization, most people can think of maybe one time that they felt, a little bit of compassion to themselves, or a little bit of courage to help them get through something hard, or a little bit of clarity and wisdom, a moment when you just knew what the right thing to do was. Some people might have fewer of those moments than others that they can recall. And it just depends, again, how many parts may be kind of clouding the view here. But our goal is to lead with ourself as much as possible. Lead with those true innate qualities of clarity and compassion and courage in our lives, in our relationships, as much as possible. But that doesn't mean we get rid of these other parts. So let's talk about these other parts briefly, just review their function. And I think it might be helpful to kind of see it in this flow chart to get a different idea of it. So the first parts that break off from the self, we would call exiles. And exiles are parts of us that hold our most extreme pain. So when we've had situations where we didn't feel loved, when we didn't feel taken care of, when we were actually maybe actively harmed or neglected, or just something happened that we really just didn't understand, we couldn't comprehend, it didn't fit in our framework of understanding the world. These parts form to hold that pain, that non-integrated pain for us, because the brain is very smart and it knows if you are just flooded with this constant sense of unintegrated pain that you can't make sense of, that you can't process, it overwhelms you, you're not going to function. And so it breaks off, it causes a little schism, it breaks off and it forms these exiles. These are these kind of dark, shadowy parts of ourselves that hold our pain for us. We all have them. It's impossible to get through life without these. They are not bad. They are survival tools. They are essential survival tools. What we sometimes forget, though, is as we grow up, we can actually go back and we can release these exiles of the pain and the burdens that they hold. So they don't actually have to hold this pain forever. We can help them release through time. And this gives us more access to the core self, but it's not that the exiles are bad or we just want to get rid of them. We just want to be able to work with them. Now, the longer we go without releasing these burdens that these exiles are carrying, without releasing the pain that the exiles are carrying, we're going to have more parts of ourselves schism off. So these are going to be parts called managers and firefighters. Some people would also call them protectors or extreme protectors. That would be another way to say it. I do like that concept of protector and extreme protector because I think it allows us to have more compassion for these parts of us. But manager and firefighter is in some ways a little more descriptive of the kind of energies they hold. So I like those too. So basically what happens is this is another schism that happens, right? We just have this unintegrated pain of this exile, and if we cannot release that pain, then another part of us will break off to be kind of a buffer between us and the exile. And so we'll have less access to that exile because they're surrounded by all these parts of our psyche that are protecting us from it. And so the first ones are usually called managers. And these are going to be ways that we basically exert control and discipline and rigidity in our environment. They're distraction mechanisms, basically. So this is things like perfectionism or self-criticism or people-pleasing or being judgmental of others, even just being type A, right? This would be a manager. And they're protective. So again, the goal is not to get rid of these managers, and this can be hard because they can cause us a lot of problems. If we have this perfectionist part of ourselves, it can make us really miserable, right? If we have these standards for ourselves that are unrealistically high and we are in a constant state of maybe workaholism and overfunctioning because we have this perfectionist manager that is trying to protect us from pain, so it's keeping us focused on being perfect all the time, that part of us is going to cause us pain. It's going to cause us its own kind of pain and suffering. It's ironic, right? Because it's trying to protect us from the pain of the exile, so it's distracting us with this other pain instead, right? This other dysfunction instead. But we all need these coping mechanisms. So as I said before, it really is impossible to go through life without exiles forming, without managers forming. This is just a part of life. This is just a part of being human. This is just the nature of the mind. We are not just going to be a pure baby core self forever. We're going to have increasing complexity in the aspects of our psyche as we grow and develop, and that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. We just want to have these parts of us as functional as possible. We want to have as positive of relationships with them as possible so we can work with them so they can help us more than hinder us. And the problems that happen with managers when they get very extreme beliefs in terms of like, if I'm not perfect, I might as well be dead, right? Or if I'm not perfect, everyone I know will hate me, right? They start to get these extreme beliefs, which we might intellectually realize, like, that's absurd. There's no way that that's actually true, but it feels very real in our body because this part of us absolutely believes it. There is a part of us that 100% believes it. And so if from ourself, we can start to have these qualities of clarity and compassion come into the managers and help shift them, then often they will soften a bit and they will help us without being so extreme. So a manager that is a perfectionist, for example, might shift into a manager that just wants us to do our best. That's really positive. Having a part of us that's like, I always want you to do your best. Like, always make sure that you are proud of the job you did. That's like a really positive message. That would be a really positive thing that can help us progress in our lives and do really well. So these hurts, again, they're not bad. They're not things to get rid of, but we do want to help them be less extreme so that they can be more supportive to us and less of a drain on us. Now, it may be a little easier to see how that happens with a manager, with the example I gave of the perfectionist part. It might be harder to see for the firefighter parts because these tend to be the things that are really thought of in pathological ways in our society. So these are often things like addiction, eating disorders, self-harm, suicidality even, like really extreme behaviors that maybe have landed people in jails. Maybe there's an aggression firefighter, right, that commits violence as a distraction from pain, or landed you in treatment, right, or in an institution of some kind, or has caused you to really schism from relationships or be cut off from relationships in your family or community or friend group, or has lost you jobs, right? Anyone who struggles with addiction may really have a very negative feeling towards the firefighter that causes them these compulsive behaviors of, continuing to drink, for example, even when it's costing you relationships and employment and, a place, a home to come back to. So it can be much harder to have a positive relationship with these parts when it's like, oh my gosh, but it's causing me so much pain. I would say that chronic illness, depending on how severe it is, right? If it's something that's a little more mild, maybe it would fit into manager, just like you have high blood sugar, right? Or something like that, some anxiety, you're a bit overweight, you just have some mild joint pain, things like that might be in the more manager category. But when they get extreme, when it comes to these kinds of conditions like mast cell activation syndrome or dysautonomia or autoimmunity or extreme depression, extreme anxiety, I would call these more firefighters, right? And these are mechanisms that your brain uses to distract you from pain that you are holding deeper in your psyche because the manager wasn't enough. So firefighters only form in response to the most extreme pain. So some of the more intensely painful things that you've experienced, some of your darker and more painful exiles. And the idea here is that the manager is not enough to fully distract you. So you need something really extreme. And what your brain has decided, and probably very rightfully decided, that it is better, at least it was at some point, it was better for you to have the extreme experience of your addiction or your illness or your binge eating disorder, whatever it was, than to feel the pain of the exile, because your brain will often know if you are not ready. And if your brain decides you are not ready to integrate these incredibly painful experiences we have, it'll do anything it can to distract you, even if it means causing you other kinds of pain. Right, so we talked about, perfectionist causes you pain too, but really the firefighters can cause a lot of pain. It can cause some really serious situations in your life. And this is often when people really reach their rock bottom. And when we reach that rock bottom, whether it's through addiction or it's through an illness, as a lot of people listening to this have experienced, for a lot of us, it's really come through our physical health totally disintegrating. We have a choice then. We can decide we can keep going with all this firefighting. We can keep going, distracting ourselves from the deeper pain, or we can decide that we are ready to actually face and integrate that pain. And we have to learn to call up the qualities of that core self that are still in there somewhere, even if they feel buried really deep. And we have to cultivate that until we feel strong enough to actually face that exile and to actually unburden it and let it release the pain that it's been holding. So we can't just keep overriding the pain. And this is where my approach to dealing with these issues differs from some limbic retraining programs, which kind of just has you override your pain. I do think that sometimes we have to go into the pain. We have to actually unburden. Now, this doesn't mean you just go to therapy and you talk about your problem over and over again. You talk about your trauma over and over again until you're blue in the face and you're just wallowing in it. That's not the answer either. But there's very specific techniques we can do to unburden these exiles. These are things that I do in my sessions with people, so we can go through this work together. There's a very step-by-step process that we can go through to release these burdens and the pain that the exiles are holding. And this is also things that people can do on their own. You know, if it feels scary and overwhelming, I don't recommend diving into it on their own. Some people do seem to be able to use this as a self-help tool successfully. And so I do have an art project that I can show you, that I encourage you guys to work on your own time. This is in your course curriculum. They said it's parts workflow chart and art prompt. So if you're going to do this, I would recommend not jumping straight to the exile. We always want to soften our firefighters and our managers first before we ever try to access exiles. So I have this called making perks cards, an art project. Some people call this soul collage. There's different ways to talk about this, but basically you make a little 5x7 card. Now, if you want to draw it, I really encourage that. There's something about actually like putting pen or paint or pastel or whatever you're using to paper that can be so therapeutic. And it doesn't have to be something that, you know, can be hung in an art gallery, right? Like, this doesn't have to look good. That's not the point at all. But sometimes it is just very therapeutic to actually take, you know, some art medium and actually physically like use your hand and move your body and create something like this. So if you're up for that, I really encourage it. You could also use collage. You could cut out pictures from magazines or newspapers. A lot of times used bookstores will have tons of old magazines for sale, like old National Geographics and stuff for super cheap. You can go buy to use for collages if you're uncomfortable with drawing, but also you could just get, you can do this on, I'm sure there's lots of free software out there. You know, Canva is one. It's cost a monthly membership, but there's tons of software out there where you can just go and kind of make collages or make flowcharts or make things online using a template as well, and just kind of use stock photos. Like Adobe, you can do that on Adobe as well. So if you have any of those programs, you could just do it online too. I think it's sometimes more therapeutic to actually, like I said, use your hands and do it, materially, but you could also do it on the computer if that feels better for you or that feels more accessible to you, and then print it out. And so basically identify the part you want to work with. And again, I recommend starting with the firefighters or the managers, and then investigate what aspects of the world it displays. So all parts of us will have different kind of energetic signatures. Well, it will remind us of a certain element, like oh, it's very fiery, or oh, it's kind of watery, or it's very hard. Like, it reminds me of like a rock, right? There'll be these kind of energetic elemental qualities to it, or it'll remind you of an animal or a plant or some kind of a gemstone, or maybe a mythological archetype, right? So there's a lot about mythological archetypes in this work that can come up. So it might remind you of like, oh my gosh, it reminds me of, Achilles, from the Greek mythology, or it reminds me of, the goddess Aphrodite, or, there's all these mythological characters that we may have grown up with, and so that's just one example from Greek mythology, right? We might be more familiar with mythology from another culture, another part of the world, if there's a character or a deity, right, that it reminds us of, or even a character from a story. When I do this work with people, very often people will have Disney characters come up. Like, I've had people do like an entire deck of these cards just with Disney characters that remind them of the different parts of themselves, and it totally works. So it doesn't have to be serious. It can also just be kind of light and silly, and it's still very powerful. And so once you come up with an image or a series of images, right, it can be kind of a collage of a few different things. You can put that on about a 5x7 card. The idea here is just so you can actually have like a deck of cards that you can look through and work with. And 5x7 is enough room to, make a little more of an in-depth image. And once you do it, like really spend some time with it. Like think about how you feel towards it. Think about where you feel it in your body. And that's how we can start to work with it. It's like noticing how we feel towards it, trying to shift the energy we're sending towards it. If we notice anything other than those 4 or 8 C's, right? If we notice anything other than those aspects of ourselves that are related to our core self, if we feel frustration or anger or disgust, anything like that, that's a sign that we need to shift our attitude towards it, right? So that we can come to it. We're leading actually from ourself and not from another part, because otherwise we're just having our parts inside of us just fighting with each other instead of leading with our core self. And so once you're able to view it with that compassion or that courage or that clarity, then we can actually start to work with it. We can talk to it, right? We can just kind of meditate on it. We can sit with it. There's many things that we can do to change our relationship with it. So this is something you can do on your own. It's a wonderful tool. But again, as you start to get more working with these parts, it may be helpful to use one of our sessions for that, or to, book a package. I do have packages of, 4 or 8 sessions where we can really delve into this work as well. Okay.